It all came crashing down 34 minutes into what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez believed would be her crowning moment as the voice of a generation. This was her chance to finally go head-to-head with a Republican on an even playing field. Not some old white-haired man in a suit she could easily write off as out of touch. Not some corporate politician she could ridicule for being a puppet for billionaires. But J.D. Vance, a Yale law grad, a best-selling author, and a fellow millennial who genuinely seemed to get her generation. He was someone she was confident she could beat. She had been prepping for this town hall for weeks. Her outfit was chosen with meticulous care. She had it all: the old red suit, gold hoop earrings, perfect hair and makeup, camera-ready looks, memorized talking points, and sound bites engineered to go viral. Her team had strategized for every conceivable question. Our crafting answers specifically to generate clips that would take over social media for days. This was supposed to be her moment. 62 million people were tuned in live on CNN. It was her opportunity to teach America about democratic socialism, the Green New Deal, and why her generation was demanding bold moves on climate, health care, and inequality. It was also a chance to paint the Republican vice president as just another protector of the old way of doing things. But what she hadn't planned for, what she couldn't have planned for, because she'd spent 6 years dodging it, was someone who would simply ask her to back up her own policies with numbers, details, and actual math. And now, 34 minutes in, Vice President J.D. Vance had just lobbed the simplest yet most devastating question imaginable. Congresswoman, you're proposing to spend $10 trillion on the Green New Deal over 10 years. You've told us the first $1.5 trillion will come from taxing the wealthy. So, where, specifically, does the other $8.5 trillion come from? She tried to give an answer. She began by saying that modern monetary theory shows we can invest in our future. Vance gently cut her off, asking her to actually explain modern monetary theory. She couldn't. Not really, just stammering out some vague words about sovereign currency and productive capacity that made it painfully obvious she'd never truly studied it. She then pivoted, talking about the economic growth that would come from green jobs. He then asked what growth rate she was assuming. Was it 3%, 5%, or maybe 8%? She had no idea. She hadn't calculated it, and had never actually run the numbers to see if that growth could generate enough tax revenue to foot the bill. And she tried to fall back on the line. We can't put a price tag on saving the planet. It was the emotional appeal that always landed on Twitter, but Vance calmly replied that he wasn't questioning if climate change was important. He agreed that it was. He was simply asking if her specific plan was even mathematically possible. And so now, there she was, standing at her podium and stammering, her confident social media persona completely gone, replaced by the look of someone who just realized they'd been asked to show their work for a test they never studied for. The cameras zoomed in tight on her face. Every single person in that CNN studio in Atlanta could see it. Every one of the 62 million viewers at home could see it too. She had absolutely no idea where the money was going to come from. Not a clue. She introduced the Green New Deal resolution 6 years ago and, apparently, never bothered to check if it was actually affordable. She had given hundreds of speeches about it, fired off countless tweets, done Instagram live streams, and even worn the slogan on T-shirts. But she had never done the math. And J.D. Vance, the working-class kid from Ohio who pulled himself out of poverty by way of the Marines and Yale law, the one who wrote a bestseller about the very forgotten Americans politicians like AOC claimed to speak for, was just standing there calmly at his podium, a slight smile on his face, it waiting for an answer she couldn't give because she didn't have one. She had never known. She just assumed that her passion and moral certainty would be enough. They weren't. But to really understand how we got to this moment, to this frozen second, where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's entire political brand began to crumble on live TV, we need to rewind. Not far, just 34 minutes, back to when she first walked onto that stage thinking she was about to have her finest hour. 2 weeks earlier, CNN had announced something pretty unusual. It was a special town hall event billed as a generational debate. 2 millennial leaders, 2 different visions for America. On one side, you had Vice President J.D. Vance, 41 years old, a Marine vet, a Yale law grad, a venture capitalist who became a senator and then vice president, and the author of Hillbilly Elegy, the memoir about growing up poor in Appalachia that became required reading for anyone trying to understand the forgotten working class. On the other side was Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, 35 years old, a Democratic socialist, a member of The Squad, co-sponsor of the Green New Deal, a social media powerhouse with millions of followers, the face of the progressive movement, and the youngest woman ever elected to Congress. They were the same generation with wildly different politics, yet both claimed to represent working Americans. CNN had been promoting it non-stop. It was a battle for the future of American politics, a clash of ideologies, a debate over who truly spoke for millennials. AOC, for her part, had accepted immediately. This was precisely the kind of stage where she shined. The town hall format meant she could forge an emotional connection with the audience, tell compelling stories, and make people feel something. Plus, with Jake Tapper moderating, she knew she'd be working with a real journalist, not some Fox News host looking for an ambush. Her team was absolutely ecstatic. This was their chance to confront the Republican VP head-on, to show all of America that her bold, transformative, and uncompromising vision was exactly what the country needed. For years, they had been dismissed as too radical, too unrealistic, too extreme. Now, they were about to prove all the critics wrong. Meanwhile, behind the scenes at the White House, Vance's team was just as pleased, though for entirely different reasons. They had spent weeks preparing, not with talking points and sound bites, but with spreadsheets, deep policy analyses, and meticulous examinations of every single piece of legislation AOC had introduced over her 6 years in Congress. Vance himself had personally reviewed every last bit of it. Every bill, every amendment, every resolution. He had run the numbers, calculated the costs, and pinpointed all the gaps, those spots where passionate rhetoric crashed against the hard wall of mathematical impossibility. And he found a lot of gaps, mainly because AOC had spent 6 years introducing sweeping legislation that sounded transformative, but were really just collections of aspirational goals lacking any actual implementation plans. They were bills that promised the world, but never explained how to pay for it all or how to make any of it really work. She had gotten away with it for years, partly because a friendly media never pressed her on the details, and partly because her supporters cared more about the grand vision than the nitty-gritty of execution. After all, tax the rich and the Green New Deal sounded great, so nobody thought to ask the uncomfortable questions about the basic arithmetic. Vance, however, was about to ask those very questions. His strategy was disarmingly simple. He'd used it time and again, in law school debates at Yale, in high-stakes business negotiations in Silicon Valley, and in Senate hearings right in Washington. You let your opponent make their claims. You don't interrupt. You don't attack. You just ask them to explain how it all actually works. If their policy is solid, they'll be able to explain it clearly, and everyone walks away a little smarter. But if the policy is weak, they'll expose themselves. He's stumbling when they can't answer basic questions about their very own proposals. And AOC's policies, Vance had concluded after weeks of intense study, were very, very weak. And she was about to expose that herself. The CNN studio down in Atlanta was packed well beyond capacity. The whole place was set up just like a town hall. There were two podiums facing each other at a slight angle, with the audience arranged in a semicircle all around them. Cameras were positioned everywhere, ready to catch every single reaction. The audience itself had been carefully selected. A perfect 50-50 split between Democrats and Republicans, every one of them under 40, and all known for being vocal about their politics. At precisely 6 p.m. Eastern, Jake Tapper walked out, taking his position right between the two podiums. Good evening from Atlanta. Tonight, we have a conversation between two of the most prominent millennial voices in American politics. He then gestured to stage left. Vice President J.D. Vance, a Marine Corps veteran, a graduate of Yale Law School, a former venture capitalist, the former senator from Ohio, and author of the best-selling memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, about growing up in America's forgotten communities, and now serving as the 49th Vice President of the United States. Vance walked out wearing a simple dark suit and a blue tie, no extra flourishes. He gave a nod to the audience, acknowledged Tapper, and then took his place at his podium. He looked comfortable but not showy, like a man who'd done this 1,000 times before and felt he had nothing to prove. Tapper then gestured to stage right. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York's 14th District. At 29, she became the youngest woman ever elected to Congress. She's a member of the House Financial Services and Oversight Committees, a Democratic socialist, the co-sponsor of the Green New Deal, a champion of Medicare for all, and a powerful voice for millions of young Americans who are demanding transformative change. AOC's entrance, by contrast, was perfectly choreographed. She had planned it. It was all there: the confident stride, the big smile, the wave to the audience. She was wearing a striking, bright red suit that she knew would photograph well, and of course, the gold hoop earrings that had become part of her signature look. This was her moment, and she was clearly ready to own it. The Democratic side of the audience erupted in loud cheers. This was their champion, their voice, the one person who, to them, finally understood what their generation truly needed. She took her position at the podium, adjusted the microphone, arranged her notes, and flashed a smile for the cameras. Ready! Tapper then laid out the ground rules for the night. It would be 90 minutes, starting with opening statements, followed by questions from him and from the audience. Respectful disagreement was encouraged. Personal attacks, however, would not be tolerated. Both participants nodded in agreement. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, you won the coin toss. You have the opening statement. AOC took a deep breath. She had rehearsed this moment 50 times. It was perfect. Thank you, Jake. And thank you to everyone watching at home. We've come together tonight in a moment of crisis. In fact, multiple crises. There's a climate crisis that's threatening the very existence of our civilization. There's an inequality crisis where billionaires are hoarding obscene amounts of wealth while working families can barely afford rent, or health care, or an education. A health care crisis where medical bankruptcy is literally destroying lives. And a student debt crisis that's crippling an entire generation. She paused, letting it hang in the air for effect. She wanted the gravity of her words to sink in. For far too long, we've been told that bold solutions just aren't realistic, that we have to be incremental, that we can't afford to dream big. Well, I reject that. Our generation rejects that. We're demanding a Green New Deal to save our planet and create millions of good-paying jobs. We're demanding Medicare for all to guarantee health care as a basic human right. We're demanding tuition-free college so that every single young person has a real opportunity. And we're demanding housing as a right, not as a commodity. Her voice started to rise now, filled with passion. This was her sweet spot. We don't need tiny, incremental changes. We don't need to compromise with corporations and their billionaire owners. What we need is a total transformation. And that right there is what I'm fighting for. Not because it's easy, but because it is absolutely necessary. The Democratic side of the room absolutely erupted in applause and cheers. This was precisely what they came here to hear. AOC just smiled, soaking it all in. Yeah, this was going well. Tapper then turned to Vance. Mr. Vice President, your opening statement. Vance gazed out at the audience. When he spoke, his voice was conversational, not like a practiced speech, but more like he was just talking to a group of people. Thank you, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. I have to say, I actually agree with a lot of what you just said. Climate change is absolutely real, and we should be addressing it. Healthcare costs are way too high, and we definitely need to fix that. And yes, education is far too expensive, and we need to make it more affordable. Those are all very real problems. Then, he paused, where you and I disagree, however, is on the solutions. You, it seems, believe in slogans. I, on the other hand, believe in actually solving problems. You believe in what sounds good on a tweet. I believe in what will actually work in the real world. You seem to believe in bold proposals without needing to explain how they'd be paid for, or even how they'd be implemented. I, however, believe in asking the hard questions before we go spending trillions of dollars. AOC's smile tightened, just a little. This wasn't the kind of Republican response she was expecting. Usually, they just attacked her or denied the problems even existed in the first place. But this was different. Vance kept going. So, tonight, I'm going to do something very, very simple. I'm just going to ask you to explain your own policies. That's all. No personal attacks, no gotcha questions. Just explain how the things you've proposed would actually work, with numbers, with details, and with an honest acknowledgement of the trade-offs and the costs. He looked at her directly. If your policies are good, then you'll have no problem explaining them. And if they're not, well, that'll become obvious too. He then turned back to the audience. And then we'll let the American people decide if these are serious solutions to serious problems or just expensive bumper stickers that sound good but would never actually function in reality. The Republican side clapped. But then something else happened. Some of the Democrats in the crowd looked thoughtful, almost like they wanted to hear the answers to those questions too. AOC felt a small knot of unease form in her stomach, but she quickly pushed it down. She knew her policies inside and out. She'd been giving speeches about them for 6 years straight. She could definitely handle this. I welcome that conversation, she said with confidence. She had absolutely no idea what she had just welcomed. Jake Tapper glanced down at his notes, then looked back up at the two of them. Let's start with health care, since you both brought it up. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, you've been a very vocal supporter of Medicare for all. Could you walk us through how a system like that would work? AOC nodded. This was her signature issue after all. She had talked about this hundreds of times. Medicare for all would finally, at long last, guarantee health care as a human right in the richest country on earth. Every single American would finally have comprehensive coverage. That means no premiums, no deductibles, no copays, no surprise medical bills, and no restrictive networks. If you get sick, you go see a doctor, and you get the treatment you need. It's that simple. And in doing so, we would join every other developed nation in the world that has already figured this out. Applause broke out from the Democratic side. Several people were nodding their heads enthusiastically. Vance raised his hand just slightly. Tapper nodded in his direction. Congresswoman, I'll admit, that does sound appealing. I do have a few questions, though, if you don't mind. Of course. Now, Medicare for all, as you've just described it, would get rid of private health insurance entirely. Right now, there are about 180 million Americans who get their insurance through their job. So all of those plans would be completely eliminated. Is that correct? AOC didn't even hesitate. They would get much better coverage through the government. No more fighting with insurance companies. No more being denied care. Just health care. I understand that's the goal, but I'm asking about the actual mechanism. Those 180 million people would, in fact, lose their current plans. Is it a yes or a no? We would transition them to a superior public coverage plan. So, yes. So, that's a yes. Their existing health plans would simply disappear. Vance, looking prepared, pulled out a small notebook. It was clear he had done his homework. Then he shifted gears, saying, "Now, let's talk about the cost." The Urban Institute, a think tank leaning left, had estimated Medicare for all would run about $34 trillion over 10 years. He asked, Do you dispute that figure? AOC seemed a little annoyed by the question. She responded that various studies offered different estimates based on their assumptions, but $34 trillion fell within the mainstream range. She quickly added, "It's not some far-right number. The Urban Institute," she pointed out, "is actually progressive. So, roughly $34 trillion over a decade then." She conceded, "That's accurate enough." "It's in the ballpark of estimates," she confirmed. And then, simply, yes. Vance did a quick mental calculation. His tone stayed conversational, not aggressive, just inquiring. He then articulated, "Okay, so $34 trillion over 10 years works out to $3.4 trillion annually. Considering the current federal budget totals around $6 trillion per year," he continued, "you're proposing to add $3.4 trillion each year to federal spending. That," he emphasized, "would be a 57% jump in the size of our federal government." Then he asked, How exactly would you pay for something like that?" AOC, as expected, had her answer prepared. She had faced variations of this very question many times. She explained, "We'd put in place a progressive tax system, asking the wealthiest Americans to finally contribute their fair share. We'd also close corporate tax loopholes that currently allow billion-dollar companies to pay absolutely nothing in federal taxes. And we'd implement a financial transaction tax on Wall Street speculation. Plus, we'd actually save money by removing the profit motive and cutting administrative waste from our current system." It sounded quite good, in theory. She delivered her points with clear confidence, but Vance, already ahead, was pulling out even more notes. He countered, "Let's actually walk through that, point by point." He began, "Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax proposal is likely the most aggressive one ever seriously put forward. That would raise roughly $3 trillion over 10 years, based on most estimates, which breaks down to $300 billion annually. But you need $3.4 trillion every single year. So, where does the remaining $3.1 trillion come from? AOC felt a distinct chill, sensing the trap forming. She suggested, closing corporate loopholes would generate hundreds of billions. Vance responded, see, the Congressional Budget Office estimates closing all major corporate tax loopholes would actually only bring in about $100 billion per year. So now we're at $400 billion out of that $3.4 trillion needed. You still need $3 trillion more annually. He pressed, what else have you got? She continued, the financial transaction tax on Wall Street trades could possibly raise $50 billion each year, according to CBO estimates. Vance quickly added, and that's a generous estimate. See, assuming it doesn't drastically cut trading volume, which it almost certainly would. So, we're now at $450 billion, he summarized, still short by roughly $3 trillion annually. That, by the way, is more than our entire defense budget. He asked again, where is all that money going to come from? AOC was visibly starting to feel frustrated. This wasn't how these kinds of discussions typically unfolded for her. Normally, when she listed revenue sources, people would just nod along and move on to the next topic. But Vance, instead, was actually double-checking every calculation. She tried a different angle, asserting, we would save a significant amount of money by cutting out insurance company profits and drastically reducing administrative costs. Vance, with a practiced motion, flipped to another page in his notebook. He cited, all health insurance company profits, when combined, the only total about $20 billion annually. Administrative savings, even in a best-case scenario, might reach $200 billion each year. He quickly added, though most economists consider that optimistic, given that government programs themselves incur administrative costs. But, for argument's sake, let's use that number. So, we've now added $220 billion in potential savings to our $450 billion in new revenue. That brings the total to $670 billion. You still need $2.7 trillion more annually, a congresswoman. He paused, then looked directly at her. His expression wasn't hostile at all. It was almost curious, like a professor prompting a student to solve a complex problem. Congresswoman, he stated calmly, you're still short by $2.7 trillion every year. To put that in perspective, he continued, that's more than our entire defense budget, plus all spending on education, plus all Veterans Affairs, combined. He repeated, so, where does that enormous sum come from? A long, the uncomfortable silence filled the room. The audience remained absolutely silent, watching and waiting intently. AOC, desperate, tried yet another angle. She suggested economic growth, stemming from a healthier population, would generate additional revenue. Vance shot back, what specific growth rate are you actually assuming? He elaborated, specifically, what percentage increase in our GDP? She offered, two studies have indicated that universal healthcare systems can indeed foster economic growth. Vance cut her off, saying, I'm asking for a concrete number. He pressed, are we talking 3% GDP growth, 5%, 10%? You're proposing to spend $3.4 trillion every single year. Surely you must have calculated what exact rate of economic growth would be needed to generate enough extra tax revenue to cover that cost. Another extended, tense pause followed, with cameras zooming in tight on AOC's face. So the truth was, she didn't have a number. She had never calculated one. She had never truly run the numbers to see if economic growth could actually generate sufficient revenue. She finally said, "I would need to consult with economists to provide you with specific growth projections." Vance's voice remained gentle, almost soft, but his words were utterly devastating. He stated, "You don't know. So do you? You've been advocating for Medicare for all for 6 years straight. You've even introduced legislation. You've given countless speeches. You've told millions of Americans that this is the solution to our healthcare crisis. Yet you've never actually bothered to calculate if it's even mathematically possible to fund it." AOC's face visibly flushed red. Her voice, strained, rose in a defensive tone. "And I'm not about to play Washington's math games while people are literally dying because they can't afford their insulin, can't get in to see a doctor, or are facing bankruptcy over medical bills." But Vance didn't raise his voice. He didn't get defensive. He just calmly responded. "It's not a game, Congresswoman. It's simple arithmetic. You're asking the American people to put their trust in you to completely reorganize 1/6 of the entire economy. You're to get rid of the health insurance that 180 million people currently have, and to spend $3.4 trillion of their money every single year. The very least you owe them is a clear explanation for how you plan to pay for it all." Then he turned slightly, addressing the audience directly. "If someone came to any one of you and asked to borrow $3.4 trillion a year, but couldn't tell you how they'd pay you back, would you hand over the money?" Several people in the audience started shaking their heads, even a few on the Democratic side of the aisle. AOC tried to jump back in. "What about the moral imperative of health care as a human right?" "I'm not questioning the moral imperative. I'm questioning whether your specific plan is actually viable. And based on this conversation, I don't think you know if it is, because you've never run the numbers." Silence. It was an uncomfortable silence. AOC had no comeback because, well, he was right. She'd never actually done the math. She had never needed to before. Passionate speeches and moral appeals had always been enough, until now. Jake Tapper, clearly sensing the tension in the room, tried to move things along. "Let's shift to another topic. The Green New Deal. Congresswoman, this has really been your signature legislative proposal. Could you walk us through what exactly that would entail?" AOC was obviously grateful for the change in subject. This was her home turf, her creation. The Green New Deal is a sweeping plan to tackle the climate crisis head-on, while also creating millions of good-paying union jobs. We would transition to 100% renewable energy in just 10 years. We'd retrofit every single building in America to be energy efficient. We would build out high-speed rail so we can finally move away from air travel. It would guarantee good jobs for anyone who wants one, and it provides support for the communities that have long depended on fossil fuels. It is the only climate plan that truly matches the scale of the crisis we're all facing. Vance let her finish, and then simply asked, "So, how much would it cost?" "Estimates vary, depending on," she began, but he pressed, "Just give me your rough estimate. Are we talking 1 trillion, 10 trillion, or 50 trillion? "I don't have an exact cost estimate," she admitted. The resolution was always meant to be aspirational, a framework, not a piece of detailed legislation. Vance interrupted, but gently. "So you don't have a cost estimate. You introduced a resolution that calls for the complete transformation of the American economy, and you didn't even calculate what it would cost." First of all, the resolution laid out goals and principles. It's not some detailed budget. But surely you must have some idea of the sheer magnitude of the costs we're talking about. You could see AOC was getting defensive again. The cost of inaction is far higher, she retorted. I agree. We absolutely should act. I'm asking about your specific plan. Now, the American Action Forum, and yes, I admit it's a conservative think tank, so take this with a grain of salt, estimated it would be $93 trillion over 10 years. And does that number seem wildly off to you? That's just a right-wing group trying to make it sound more expensive than it is. So what's your estimate, then? Again, silence, because she didn't have one. Vance then pulled out his notes again. Let me just walk you through some of the basic calculations. Your Green New Deal resolution calls for upgrading every existing building in the United States to meet new energy efficiency standards. There are roughly 140 million buildings in America. That's houses, apartments, offices, and stores. The average cost for what's called a deep energy retrofit is around $30,000 per building. That alone is $4.2 trillion, just for the buildings. He casually flipped a page in his notes. Next, your resolution calls for meeting 100% of our power demand through clean and renewable sources. Right now, we get about 60% of our electricity from fossil fuels. You're replacing all of that with solar, wind, and the necessary battery storage would cost approximately $6 trillion, according to the Department of Energy's own estimates. So, now we're already at $10.2 trillion, and that's just for those first two items. He turned another page. Your resolution also calls for building out high-speed rail on a scale where air travel would become unnecessary. For context, there are currently only about 30,000 miles of high-speed rail in the entire world. China, which has built more high-speed rail than anyone, spent roughly $2 trillion to build 25,000 miles of it. To build enough here in America to actually replace most air travel, you would need at least another $3 trillion. That brings our total to $13.2 trillion. Vance looked up from his notes. And keep in mind, we haven't even touched on the jobs guarantee, the universal health care that's also part of the resolution, the housing guarantee, or any of the other provisions. So, at least that $93 trillion figure doesn't seem so crazy now, does it? AOC was left stammering. Now, those are inflated numbers based on, she started, only for him to finish her thought. Based on your own resolution. You're the one who proposed these things. I'm just multiplying the units by the cost estimates from government agencies themselves. Tell me, what part of that am I getting wrong? She had no answer, because he wasn't getting it wrong. The truth was, she'd just never bothered to check. And still, Vance continued, his voice never lost its calm tone. He adopted an educational tone, almost like a teacher explaining a difficult concept. $93 trillion over 10 years, he began, is $9.3 trillion per year. America's entire gross domestic product is only about $25 trillion per year. You're proposing to spend 37% of the nation's entire economic output, annually, on this one program. He let that staggering number hang in the air. To put that in perspective, the entire federal government currently spends about 24% of GDP. You'd be adding another 37% on top of that. We would be at 61% of GDP going through the federal government. That would make the U.S. government larger than any government in world history, as a percentage of the economy. He then turned to the audience. How many of you, he asked, want the government controlling 61% of the economy? Not a single hand went up, not even on the Democratic side of the room. Vance turned back to AOC. See? Here's the problem with aspirational frameworks that conveniently skip the math. They sound wonderful until you actually have to implement them. Then you discover they'd require tax rates nobody would accept, for benefits nobody can calculate, using technology that doesn't exist yet, on a timeline that's simply impossible. AOC was visibly frustrated. "You're just using Republican talking points," she retorted. "I'm using a calculator," he said calmly. "That's not Republican or Democrat. 2 plus 2 equals 4, regardless of your politics." Jake Tapper tried to move the conversation forward, but Vance had already established a clear pattern. Every time AOC made a sweeping claim about what she'd do, he'd simply ask, "How?" Every time she cited a policy, he'd ask about the costs and the trade-offs. And every time she tried to pivot to emotion, he'd gently but firmly redirect the conversation back to substance. And she was clearly floundering. 21 minutes into the debate, a young woman from the audience stood up to ask a question. She held the microphone, looking nervous but determined. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, I'm a Democrat, and I voted for you," she began. "But I have a question about your record. You helped stop Amazon from building their second headquarters in Queens. That was going to be 25,000 jobs. Why did you do that?" AOC's face lit up. This was clearly a moment she was proud of. "I stood against corporate welfare," she declared. "Amazon, one of the richest companies in the world, wanted $3 billion in subsidies from New York taxpayers. I said, no, we don't need to bribe corporations to come to our communities. We need them to pay their fair share and create good jobs without handouts." Or there was a smattering of applause from some in the audience. Others, however, looked skeptical. Vance raised his hand. "May I follow up on that?" Tapper nodded. "Congresswoman, how many jobs was Amazon planning to bring?" "They promised 25,000. They guaranteed 25,000 jobs." "That wasn't a promise. That was a contractual commitment. An average salary of $150,000 per year. So that's $3.75 billion in annual wages coming into your district and the surrounding areas. You stopped that to save $300 million per year in tax incentives. That's a 12-to-1 return on investment. Most businesses would kill for a 12-to-1 ROI. He paused, letting that sink in. "So, let me make sure I understand your decision. You gave up $3.75 billion in annual wages to avoid spending $30 million in subsidies. That's like turning down $12 just to save $1. Does that make any sense to you?" AOC tried to defend her position. "Those jobs weren't for my constituents," she argued. "They were for tech workers who would have just driven up rents and displaced people. So your constituents don't want jobs that pay $150,000 a year? They would have needed training and education to qualify. So Amazon had committed to providing that very training. It was part of the deal. They were going to fund programs to train local residents, create pathways for people without 4-year degrees, and offer apprenticeships and skill development. All of that was in the agreement." Vance then pulled out yet another document from his seemingly endless supply. "And since you killed the Amazon deal," he asked, "how many comparable jobs have come to Queens?" AOC hesitated. "We've been on working with other companies." "How many? Give me a number." "I don't have the exact figure." "I do," Vance said flatly. "About 2,000. You turned down 25,000 high-paying jobs that came with training programs. In exchange, your district got about 2,000 jobs. That's 23,000 jobs that people in Queens didn't get, all because you wanted to score political points against Amazon." He looked directly at the audience. "That's not fighting for working people. And that's sacrificing them for your ideology." The audience was completely quiet. Even some of the Democrats looked uncomfortable because the math was simply undeniable. AOC tried to change the subject. I think we need to talk about who's really fighting for working people, she said. I grew up in a working-class family. I worked as a bartender. I know what struggle looks like. And that's when Vance's expression suddenly changed. For the first time in the entire debate, he looked genuinely angry. It wasn't a loud anger, but a cold, controlled, and intense anger. "Congresswoman," he began, "let's talk about working-class struggle. You grew up in Yorktown Heights, New York, a beautiful suburb, median household income, $140,000. You went to Boston University, which costs $70,000 per year. You tended bar for, 2 years after college, and then you were elected to Congress at just 29. His tone grew sharper. "And that isn't a working-class life. That's an upper-middle-class kid who took a working-class job for a little while and spun it into a political brand." A collective gasp went through the audience. This was different. It was personal. Vance pressed on, his intensity building. "I was raised in Middletown, Ohio. My mother struggled with drug addiction. My father wasn't in the picture. My grandparents brought me up in a home where we couldn't always count on having electricity or running water. And we were poor, truly poor, not 'I bartended for 2 years' poor. The kind of poor where sometimes you just didn't eat. I enlisted in the Marines because I felt I had no other choice. I used the GI Bill to cover my college tuition. I worked a full-time job all the way through Yale Law School. Every single job I've ever had, I needed just to get by. It wasn't for experience, or for stories, or to build a political brand. It was for food, for rent, for basic survival." He locked his gaze on hers. "So, when you talk about the working-class struggle, you should know I've actually lived it. You just cosplayed it for Instagram." The room fell into an absolute silence. No one moved. It felt like nobody was even breathing. But Vance wasn't finished. "And here is the thing that really gets under my skin about your politics. The policies you're proposing would absolutely crush the real working class. I'm not talking about the Twitter version or the viral clip version. I mean the real people. And the ones who work with their hands, who stress about their bills, and who can't afford the luxury of some aspirational framework. Your Green New Deal would ban fossil fuels. Do you know who actually works in oil and gas? Pipe fitters, welders, electricians, truck drivers. Working-class people from Pennsylvania and Ohio and West Virginia who don't have trust funds or college degrees. They depend on those jobs. And yet, your plan gets rid of them without offering any real alternative. Your Medicare for All plan would get rid of private insurance. And do you know who works in the health insurance industry? We're talking about 500,000 people, claims processors, customer service reps, network coordinators. These are working-class jobs. So, where do they go once you've eliminated their entire industry? Your push for a $15 minimum wage sounds compassionate on the surface. But do you know what really happens? Small businesses can't absorb that cost. So, they end up cutting staff. Younger people get locked out of entry-level jobs, and teen unemployment skyrockets. I've actually looked at the data. The results are clear. His voice started to rise. You propose these sweeping policies that get a great reaction at rallies, but they end up hurting the very people you claim to be fighting for, all because you've never had to live with the real-world consequences of a bad policy. You went from a comfortable suburb to a private university, and then straight to Congress. And you have never once experienced what it's like to watch bad policy tear a community apart. He paused for a moment. He let the weight of his words settle in the room. I have. My family has. My hometown has. We are the ones who lived through the factory closures, the disappearing jobs, and an opioid crisis that killed people I grew up with. We know exactly what happens when a policy sounds good on paper but doesn't actually work. He looked from her out to the audience. You know what it's like to get likes on Twitter, to go viral, and to be praised by celebrities and activists. That is your experience of the working-class struggle. Mine was watching my mother overdose, wondering if there would be food on the table, and joining the military because it felt like the only way out. So please, don't lecture me about working-class values. And don't you dare pretend your policies help working people when the math clearly shows they destroy working-class jobs and their communities. The audience didn't clap. They were too stunned. The moment too raw. AOC looked as if she had been physically slapped. Her hands gripped the sides of the podium. Her face was flushed red. She wanted to fire back, but she couldn't find the words, because what he said was true. And every single person in that room knew it. Jake Tapper, visibly shaken by the sheer intensity of the exchange, tried to wrestle back control of the conversation. Let's all take a breath here and move on to our next topic. We have time for just one more substantive exchange before we get to closing statements. Vance gave a slight nod. His previous intensity had faded. He was back to his calm, methodical persona. I'd like to return to the Green New Deal, if that's all right with you. Jake, I want to ask the Congresswoman to explain one very specific part of it. Tapper glanced over at AOC. She nodded in agreement, though her expression was wary. Congresswoman, your Green New Deal resolution includes something called a jobs guarantee. Could you explain exactly what that means? AOC seemed grateful to be back on the solid ground of policy, away from the personal attacks. A jobs guarantee means that the federal government would ensure that anybody who wants a job, they can have one. It would be meaningful work, with dignity and a living wage. Doing what kind of work exactly? Whatever work needs doing in our communities, things like infrastructure, care work, teaching, environmental restoration, or public service. And who decides what work needs to be done? Government agencies would coordinate with local communities to identify those needs. So, the government is the one deciding and managing these workers. Where would they be working? And what would they be paid? You could see AOC was getting frustrated. Those are just implementation details. Vance cut her off, gently but firmly. No, those are not implementation details. Those details are the entire policy. You can't just promise jobs for everyone without explaining how any of it is supposed to work. That isn't a plan. It's a slogan. So, he tried a different angle. Let me ask some simpler questions. How many folks are unemployed right now in the U.S.? It was clear AOC didn't know the answer. I'd have to look at the latest numbers from the Labor Department. It's about 6 million. So then, a jobs guarantee would have to hire at least 6 million people right away. Right. Otherwise, you're not actually guaranteeing a job for everyone when it's fully rolled out. Yes? What's the average salary for a federal government employee? Well, and it depends on the job, but roughly, on average, probably around $50,000. Okay. All right. So 6 million workers at $50,000 a pop. That's $300 billion a year in just salaries alone. Then you've got to add benefits, which for government jobs is usually another 30%. You have management costs, buildings, equipment, training. You're looking at least $400 billion a year in total. Vance looked straight at her. Where does that $400 billion come from? Which taxes are you going to raise? AOC didn't have an answer. Again, this is an investment in our people. That doesn't answer my question. Where is the $400 billion coming from? You're the one proposing this. You have to know how you're going to pay for it. Just silence. Vance kept pressing. His voice was calm, but totally relentless. And here's another question for you. Who exactly would be taking these guaranteed jobs? Would they be mandatory? If an unemployed person turns down a guaranteed job, do they lose their unemployment benefits? Or can they just decide not to work and keep collecting them? AOC started to stammer. Well, we would. There would be incentives to join, so people could turn down the jobs. So, it's not really a guarantee then, is it? It's just a really expensive jobs program that people can choose to ignore. The idea is that the jobs would be so desirable that, but who gets to decide what's desirable? What if that guaranteed job is miles away from where someone lives? What if it has nothing to do with their career? What if they just don't want to work for the government? Do they have to take it, or do they lose their benefits? Every question exposed another flaw, on another detail she simply hadn't thought through. Now, Vance wasn't trying to be mean. He was just being thorough, asking the kind of questions any serious lawmaker would have to answer before turning an idea into law. And AOC had no answers, because she had never really worked through any of the details. She just liked the way jobs guarantee sounded. Vance took a step back and looked out at the audience. Folks, do you see the pattern here? The Congresswoman suggests these huge, eye-sweeping changes to American society. But when you ask how they'll work, she has no idea. When you ask what they'll cost, she doesn't know. When you ask how to pay for them, she doesn't know. But she's absolutely convinced they have to happen. He turned back to AOC. Congresswoman, you've been in Congress now for 6 years. You're on the Financial Services Committee. You've put forward major pieces of legislation. You've given speech after speech about transforming America, and yet you can't answer the most basic questions about your own proposals. You don't know the cost. You don't know how they'll be paid for. You don't know how they would actually be put into practice. You don't know who would run them. You don't even know what sacrifices would have to be made. You just know they sound good. They feel right. And they make you popular on social media. His voice was quiet, but the words were devastating. See, that is not governing. That is performance art. And America deserves better than that. The last 20 minutes of the town hall were just painful to watch. Jake Tapper tried to give AOC a few chances to recover. He asked her about some other topics. He even tossed her some softballs about her vision for the future. But the damage was done. Every answer she gave from that point on just sounded hollow. Every passionate speech just rang false after what everyone had just witnessed. And the questions from the audience were brutal, and they were even coming from Democrats. A young man stood up. He said, "Congresswoman, I'm a progressive voter. But after listening to this, I honestly don't get how any of your proposals would actually work. Can you name just one piece of legislation you've proposed that has a detailed plan for funding and implementation?" AOC couldn't. Then a woman in her 30s spoke up. "You talk about taxing the rich, but Vice President Vance just showed that won't raise nearly enough money. Where does the rest of the money come from? Are you suggesting you're going to raise taxes on the middle class?" AOC tried to dodge the question, but Vance gently reeled it back in. "That's actually a really good question. Are you proposing tax increases on the middle class? A simple yes or no. She refused to answer directly, which, of course, was an answer in itself. A college student was next. I supported the Green New Deal, but I had no idea it would cost that much. How could you introduce it without even knowing the cost? AOC didn't have a good answer for that either. By the time they reached their closing statements, she looked completely diminished. The confident social media star from the start of the night had vanished. Her closing statement came off as defensive. She talked about how Washington insiders use math to kill bold ideas. She said, "We can't be afraid to dream big," and that the moral urgency of the crises we face calls for action, not getting stuck in analysis paralysis. It all landed completely flat, because everyone in that room had just watched her completely fail to explain her own policies. Vance's closing statement, on the other hand, was simple. First, I want to thank Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez for being here tonight. I know this wasn't easy. These are tough conversations, but they're necessary ones, because governing isn't about slogans, or viral moments, or making people feel good. It's about solving problems for real people. That requires more than just passion. It requires competence, knowledge, the ability to actually understand how policy works, to do the math, to think through the secondary consequences, to make trade-offs, and to be honest about the costs and benefits. He looked straight into the camera. The American people deserve leaders who've done their homework, who know what their proposals would cost, who can explain how they'd be put into action, and who understand that good intentions just aren't enough. Tonight, I asked the Congresswoman to explain her own policies. She couldn't. And that should concern everyone who cares about good government. It was simple, direct, and devastating. Within hours, the internet just exploded. The clips were absolutely everywhere. Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, every platform, all at once. Gee, you don't know your own tax rate? 67 million views in 2 hours. You cosplayed working-class struggle. 89 million views. The full breakdown of Green New Deal math. 134 million views. That's performance art, not governance. 78 million views. The moment where AOC couldn't explain the jobs guarantee got 56 million views. Conservative media went into overdrive. Vance destroys AOC with facts and logic. Bartender gets economics lesson from scholar. When socialism meets math, the math wins. They played the clips on an endless loop. They brought on economists to confirm Vance's numbers were accurate and marveled at how thoroughly AOC had been exposed. But the more interesting reaction came from the left. Liberal outlets tried to spin it. Vance's aggressive debate tactics raise questions. AOC faces unfair standard on policy details. Why Republicans weaponize math against progressive ideas. But even they couldn't really defend her performance. And the questions Vance had asked weren't unfair. They were basic. How much does it cost? How would you pay for it? How would it work? Those aren't gotcha questions. Those are the questions any legislator should be able to answer about their own proposals. And she couldn't answer them. The comment sections on liberal sites were brutal. I've defended AOC for years, but wow, so she got destroyed. She literally couldn't explain her own bills. How do you propose spending trillions of dollars without knowing where the money comes from? I'm progressive, but this was embarrassing. Vance asked reasonable questions, and she had no answers. She's great at Twitter, but maybe that's not the same as being good at policy. Even some progressive politicians quietly started to distance themselves. No one wanted to defend a performance that bad. And the hashtags told the story. Hashtag Explain Your Bill was trending #1 worldwide. Hashtag AOC Exposed was #2. Hashtag Math Matters was #4. Hashtag Vance Wins was #7. By the next morning, every major news organization had the story. AOC struggles to defend policies in debate with Vance. Questions mount about Ocasio-Cortez's legislative competence. When passion meets policy, AOC's difficult night. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who'd walked into the town hall thinking she'd educate America about the future of progressive politics, was now a cautionary tale about the difference between being a social media celebrity and an actual competent governor. The aftermath came quickly. Within a week, polling showed AOC's favorability had dropped 15 points. Even in her own district, support was softening. People were asking questions they'd never asked before. Does she actually know what she's doing? Or is it all just a performance? By week 2, something remarkable happened. Other members of Congress who'd co-sponsored her bills started quietly withdrawing their support. Not loudly, not with press releases, just simply letting their names be removed from the legislation. Because after that debate, nobody wanted to be associated with bills that couldn't be explained or defended. The Green New Deal resolution, which had once had over 100 co-sponsors, dropped to just 23 within a month. Medicare for All, which she'd championed, suddenly couldn't find anyone willing to defend it in the specific form she'd proposed. Her signature legislation was evaporating, not because Republicans killed it, but because Democrats were running away from it. By the end of the first month, a primary challenger announced, a moderate Democrat, a former city councilwoman, someone who actually lived in the district and knew the neighborhoods. Her announcement video was pointed. I've lived in Queens my whole life. I've raised a family here, built a business here, and served on the city council for 8 years. I know this district. I know what we need. We need serious representation, not a social media celebrity, not someone who can't explain their own policies. We need real leadership for real people. The video blew up, but not in the way AOC's videos usually did. This time, it felt authentic, real. AOC tried to fight back, of course, giving interviews where she claimed she'd been ambushed, that Vance used unfair tactics, and that expecting her to have every number memorized was just an impossible standard. But that only made things worse, because Vance hadn't actually asked for memorized numbers. He had simply asked her to explain her own proposals in broad strokes, just to show she understood the basic mechanics and costs, and she couldn't do it. By month 3, major Democratic donors started pulling their support, not because they disagreed with her values, but because they'd realized she just wasn't capable of turning those values into real, effective policy. The Squad, her group of progressive allies in Congress, stopped defending her so vigorously. They were worried about being dragged down by association, and the national progressive groups that had championed her started hedging their bets. Maybe putting all their eggs in the AOC basket hadn't been so smart after all. 6 months after the debate, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez held a press conference back in her district. She looked exhausted. That fire that usually radiated from her seemed to have dimmed. After a lot of thought and conversations with my family, I've decided not to seek re-election to Congress. I'm proud of the work we've done to shift the conversation in Washington, to bring bold ideas into the mainstream debate, and to inspire young people to believe that change is possible. But I believe I can be more effective continuing that work outside of elected office, through organizing, through movement building, and through direct action in communities. It was the standard politician's exit speech, all wrapped up in positive language, but everyone knew the real story. She couldn't win. Not after being exposed so completely. Not after proving she couldn't even defend her own policies. It was better to quit with some dignity than to lose a primary by 30 points. Her replacement in Congress ended up being the moderate Democrat who had challenged her. A woman with actual policy expertise who could explain how her proposals would work because she'd actually done the homework. And J.D. Vance, well, and he went back to being vice president. His role as the educator in that town hall debate became a case study that would be taught in political science classes for years to come. Not because he was mean or aggressive or used any tricks, but simply because he'd asked someone to explain their own policies, and they just couldn't do it. A year later, a political science professor at Yale invited Vance to speak to her class. The topic for the day was policy development and political communication. And the subtopic, inevitably, was the AOC debate. During the Q&A, a student raised her hand. "Mr. Vice President, do you feel bad about what happened to Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's career after that debate?" Vance took a moment to think. "No, I don't. She spent 6 years introducing legislation she hadn't really thought through, proposing policies that would cost trillions without knowing how to pay for them, and giving speeches that inspired people but were impossible to implement. I just asked her basic questions. How much does it cost? How would you pay for it? How would it work? Those are not unfair questions. Those are the absolute bare minimum questions any legislator should be able to answer." He paused. If asking someone to explain their own bill destroys their career, then the problem isn't the questions. The problem is that they never should have been proposing legislation they didn't understand in the first place. Another student spoke up. "But don't you think expecting detailed knowledge of funding mechanisms and implementation plans is setting the bar a little too high?" Most legislators don't know all of those details. Vance just shook his head. Most legislators know the broad strokes. They can explain, in general terms, how things would be funded and how they'd work. They've done at least enough homework to defend their own proposals. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez couldn't do that. And it wasn't because I asked unfair questions. It was because she had never bothered to learn. She had built an entire career on passion and viral moments, without ever doing the foundational work. And that isn't governance. That's just performance. And America deserves better than just performance. A third student then asked, "So what should people learn from what happened?" Vance considered the question carefully. The lesson was this: passion isn't enough. Good intentions aren't enough. And moral certainty isn't enough. Governance requires competence, knowledge, and the ability to actually understand how policy works and to think through all the consequences. AOC confused her popularity on Twitter with actual policy expertise. She thought that just because millions of people liked her posts, her policies must be sound. But those two things have nothing to do with each other. Social media rewards a performance. Governance, on the other hand, requires substance. And when you can't provide that substance, eventually, someone is going to ask you to explain yourself. He looked around the classroom. I hope that future leaders learn from what happened. Do your homework. Understand your own proposals. Be able to explain how they would actually work. Know what they're going to cost. And think through the trade-offs. Because if you can't stand up for your own policies when asked the simplest questions, you really aren't ready to be a lawmaker. You're just acting like one on television. That AOC town hall ended up becoming a case study in all sorts of different fields. Political science classes used it to show the difference between being a celebrity politician and actually governing. They talked about how fame on social media can make it seem like someone knows policy when they don't, and how voters can sometimes mistake passion for actual ability. Our economics departments used it for teaching policy analysis, showing how to figure out if ambitious plans add up mathematically and how to find the disconnect between talk and reality. Law schools even put it in their legislative drafting courses as a cautionary tale about writing bills without knowing how they actually work. Business schools started using it in their negotiation and communication classes. Vance's whole method of just asking basic questions and letting his opponent reveal their own flaws became something they taught. In total, the clips were watched hundreds of millions of times. People analyzed them from every possible angle. There was the moment Vance asked where $8 to $12 trillion would come from, and that long pause when AOC just couldn't answer. That whole working-class comparison, the jobs guarantee part, and AOC herself pretty much disappeared from national politics. She still did some organizing and stayed on social media, even though her follower count slowly dropped, and would sometimes give speeches at progressive rallies. But nobody really treated her as a serious voice on policy anymore, because they had all seen what happened when she was asked to actually explain her own ideas. She just couldn't do it. And once something like that is out in the open, you can't really take it back. Her Wikipedia page got a complete rewrite. It used to start by calling her a progressive icon and the youngest woman ever elected to Congress. Now, the very first paragraph talked about her declining influence after she failed to defend her policies in that televised debate. There was a whole new section criticizing her competence as a legislator. Sure, the part about the Met Gala dress was still there. So was her bartender to politics story. She sent all the stuff about the squad. But the story people told about her had changed. She wasn't seen as the future of the Democratic Party any longer. She had become a cautionary tale about the difference between being a celebrity and being competent. And then there was J.D. Vance, the kid from Appalachia who clawed his way out of poverty by joining the Marines and going to Yale. The guy who wrote a book about the forgotten working class, who had genuinely lived the kind of struggle AOC had only dressed up as. He became known for more than just being vice president. He was seen as the man who laid bare the emptiness of progressive rhetoric, not by attacking or tricking her, but simply by asking her to explain her own ideas and letting the world watch when she failed. Sometimes, the most powerful question you can ask is the simplest one. How does it work? And if you can't answer that, well, maybe you shouldn't be proposing.